Scotland is not short of stunning locations, and we've chosen one of the most atmospheric and historic for this latest Take a Pew film. We're here in Glencoe on a remarkably beautiful day. And there are 3 Church of Scotland ministers here, and we're going to be talking about ministry. We're all 3 of us ministers in very different parts of Scotland, but all very committed to our communities. And this is a very remote, very isolated area, and one of the themes that we want to talk about today is the theme of isolation and loneliness. But before we get going, what I'd quite like to do is to share with Gordon Strang and Sarah Ross some reflections about what drew them into ministry and what they feel really passionate about in terms of the ministries of where they are and the place that they work. So Gordon and Sarah, welcome, and it's really nice to have this opportunity in this extraordinary place to have a bit of a chat, to take a pew. So Sarah, do you want to just start off by telling us about what drew you into ministry and what you feel passionate about, and maybe tell us a wee bit about where you're actually a minister?
Currently I'm minister at Blantyre Old Parish Church, and prior to that I was at 4th St Paul's over in Lanarkshire. And ministry for me has always been a passion. I've wanted to be a minister since I was 14, so this is a long ambition of mine. And I'm very passionate about just sharing God's word and God's love with people, particularly young people, children, but just anybody really that I have an opportunity to be with and to speak with, and it's a great privilege. I think ministry gives me those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Gordon, what about you?
I was more of a slow burn, so I didn't come into ministry until my 30s, although it was a niggle that was always there that I could just never quite get rid of. So eventually I succumbed, and I have now ended up somewhere quite rural in Spey, Grantown and Spey, and the villages around there. And these are the sorts of places I was probably always drawn to, rural communities where I did a lot of my growing up, and it's where it makes most sense to me, I think, the idea that the church can be the middle of these sorts of places, in the middle of the life in these sorts of places, and that's one of my great passions, is helping the church somehow find more of that, find it again if they've lost it, and be able to do more with that. So I feel I'm in a good place for that.
I guess one of the things that is interesting to all of us, I think, as ministers, and this is not something that is restricted to rural communities, but there is an issue about isolation and loneliness. And could you maybe, Sarah, just share a wee bit with us about how you feel the role of the church is in trying to overcome some issues about isolation and loneliness for people in the context in which you're set?
I think for the church has a unique place in the sense that it can connect with different people from different walks of life. It doesn't have to be religious people,
Mm-hmm.
There are opportunities there to get involved. And I think for a long time the church has sometimes been guilty of expecting people to come to them and to support them, whereas I've always believed that the church should, be out in the community getting involved. And there's an element of where you need to get involved in local community events and start to build relationships, because if you don't build those relationships, then you don't find the people who are isolated and lonely, because you don't actually know what's going on on your own doorstep. And I think as you start to build that, it becomes easier to get involved with organisations who are working with isolated people. You have to get that trust level, because sometimes religious people are viewed very cynically or suspiciously as well, and you have to overcome that as well, I think.
Yeah. What about your experience, Gordon?
I certainly, one of the surprises about moving to Grantown and Spey is that actually the community is already very strong, and the church is only one part of a very cohesive community. But certainly it's still grief is something that isolates an awful lot of people in where I am, and where lots of people are living a lot longer and spending a long part of their lives perhaps on their own. The church is one of the places where there's the opportunity to actually have family, to have connections as families have become more dispersed and people move away. There, some of those support networks that might have been in the past are not there, and we are in a very good position. It's a privilege to be able to, I think, do some of that.
I have a growing number of people who come and touch base with me, like come and have a conversation about God stuff or spirituality, particularly after a bereavement, or if they're going through difficult times, particularly poverty as well. People who come looking for support in that sense, or if you're just out and about and talking to people, so people have an understanding of God. You just might not use the same language or the same terminology that we would use. And I think there are opportunities there for us.
Yeah. I mean, I've sometimes wondered whether one of the reasons that Jesus spent so much time with those marginalised people was because they sometimes talked a lot of sense, because people who've had really bad experiences, they know what really matters and what really counts in life. And so the idea of being alongside the poor isn't about, necessarily always transforming the circumstances of poverty, which of course is an obscenity. But it's also about hearing that wisdom that comes from the grassroots. And one of the things that we've been doing in Church and Society Council is enabling, we've called it Speak Out, which is about getting 10,000 voices for change, trying to communicate with people whose voices are often not heard, and actually asking them, so what do you think is the single thing that would make the biggest difference to ending poverty, to making a society more just and more fair? And I reckon that the church is really well placed to have those kinds of conversations with people at the grassroots. I mean, would you agree with that, Sarah?
They're certainly able to have the conversations at the grassroots if the congregation or the church is willing to engage. And I think sometimes the risk is we don't know how to engage, and we're not sure what to do. But I think we struggle sometimes at the more influential levels because we're not entirely sure necessarily how to take on, government, or how to influence policy like that. And that's when we kind of rely on, Church and Society and folks like that to do that kind of level of work. Whereas the parish minister, a lot of what I do is working with people, at the need level, I guess, and then just,
But connecting the two, the sort of the church councils where a lot of that high level engagement can happen, and then at the sort of grassroots, heather roots level, would be a challenge, but a good one, I think, is to try and mesh the two together so that people don't sort of contract out the engagement with power by saying, "Oh, the council will do that on our behalf." It's something that we all need to be engaged with in our own way.
There's a phrase that we've used quite a lot in the Church of Scotland in the last few years because of that Princess Street Garden thing, heart and soul. And I've often felt that one of the things that the Church is quite good at is being the soul of a community. But sometimes it's not been so good at being the heart of a community. And yet there are things that we can do, both in terms of worship and in terms of providing the ordinance of religion, but also in terms of being, as it were, part of the social capital of a community. And I think one of the things that we don't celebrate enough is just how much really amazing work is going on throughout Scotland, in parishes and communities all over the place. Do you agree with that?
Well, definitely. In where I live and now work, we have a small town and then two villages on either side, and in those two villages the church is the only public organisation left. The schools have long since closed. The post office, the shops, the hotels have either gone or going, and it's the church that's left. And people feel they own these buildings, of which, if you ask people to define what church is, frustratingly they'd say the building when it's not the people. But nonetheless, they own these buildings. There is a sense of ownership and belonging that they have. And
I'm probably old enough to remember a time when quite a lot of ministers used to be a kind of scary person in the community, very powerful figures in the community as well. But I think things have changed a wee bit, and probably we're more alongside people rather than lording it over people. Has that sort of thing been your experience, Sarah, would you say?
I'd certainly say that I've experienced ministers who are quite authoritarian by nature and can be intimidating, and I've always tried not to follow in those particular footsteps. So I think it's important that ministers are approachable, that folks have that opportunity to come and ask their questions, or to come and look for support. You want somebody who can understand where you're at and be down to earth and be able to connect with you rather than tell you what to do, I guess.
And ministry is an enormous privilege, isn't it?
the number of encounters you can have, the opportunity to be with people at so many different times of their life. There are very, very few occupations that allow that journey with people, not just a snapshot of their life, one moment and then gone, but actually to be able to be with people throughout all aspects of their lives, the highs and the lows and all the bits in between, and it's an enormous privilege, and it makes the days very interesting.
Do you think that sometimes people are maybe put off going into the ministry because they think they've got to be experts in dozens of different fields, and it's just too complex and diverse a job to be really good at in every area?
I think it's the busyness factor for most people. I think when you look at ministers, they always seem to be doing something. They're either at meetings or they're at church, or they're in the schools, they're at hospitals, etc. So it can feel like you're constantly busy, and I think it's important to remember you're part of teams that you can share, and I think also just to remember that it's your calling, it's part of your identity. So it's to be enjoyed. It's not supposed to be a punishment or something.
Sure.
And I think the diversity of ministry is what I love. You were saying about coming alongside families. I think when I started out in ministry, I saw a funeral as a one-off, or a baptism as a one-off, and it was only over time that I realised that you were connecting with the same family again and again. You didn't appreciate just how much of a relationship you would have with individual families, and that's a learning curve.
Being alongside them at those key moments in life as well, which is just an enormous privilege, isn't it?
It can be very, very difficult the more you get to know them, but it is always a privilege. It's always kind of beautiful, I guess, in its own way, to have that.
Sitting in these pews in the middle of Glencoe makes me think about, I guess we're going through what might be described as some people describe it as decline, but I think it's more change. And where else should people be embracing change more than in the church? The idea of Jesus dying and being reborn through the resurrection. So it's been good to sit on this pew today in this absolutely stunning location, and I've really enjoyed the conversation that we've had today, so thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.